So today we're going to do trivia or myths. Myth is hard to say. It's mask. Myth,
Masks and myths.
masked.
So
Myth,
it's
myth.
historical myths that maybe we believe and we shouldn't believe.
Let's just go ahead and start with one right now, okay? And this is the one I thought was true, but maybe it's not. I don't know. Maybe it's true. So people were shorter back then, right? You got short beds. You go to the Frontier Culture Museum. These beds are like 5 feet long. There's whatever. So what's the deal on this? What's
Okay,
the
well, the reality is that people were not that much shorter back then. If you thought that people 150 years ago were a couple inches shorter, and you just keep going backwards in time, I mean, when you get back to like Jesus, he would have been 4 inches tall.
right?
So it just doesn't totally make sense when you think about it. However, you do have some evidence staring you in the face. You've got those shorter beds that you talked about. You've got, when you go into cabins, log cabins, the doorways are shorter, right? And
It's 1 3/4 right here, man.
that's right. And when you go sit in, like if you go to the Frontier Museum and you sit in the Irish House, all the chair legs are shorter. So it's like, well, it just seems to make sense. The reality is that people were not that much shorter. And if you go back, it's interesting, but they were a little bit shorter. So why the short beds? Well, let's just kind of tick off the problems. Short beds are because people thought that it was a lot healthier to sleep sitting up. So they would have big round bolsters behind them and they'd sleep sitting up. So the bed didn't need to really be that long, and they really weren't that much shorter than they are now. But the beds weren't, and the people weren't either. But so people slept sitting up, and they slept with their windows open. They thought it was better for your breathing. And considering the amount of respiratory disease, the number one killer through much of history was always what was called consumption, which was tuberculosis, and that is a respiratory issue. So they did everything they could to have invigorating, cold, fresh air that would come in, and you could take it all in if you're sitting better. And you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. So there's the beds. The log cabins and the doorways are, you build your log cabin with these logs, and then you've got to cut out the doors. So it's really hard to cut out those logs in between. So you don't make them by shorter pieces of logs. You cut out the openings. So when you remove those openings, you're also removing the structural support of the building. So it makes sense to not have something too high. And also, so to not let out your hot air too when you're heating. You think we don't have central heating back, a couple hundred years ago. So you want to keep your warm air in that you have and not let it out. Okay. So, and then the especially for the Irish House at the Frontier Museum, the shorter chair legs are the Irish. Their main source of heat was peat, and it's a kind of it's like burning coal, like, and so you get kind of smoky in the house. So if you kind of be below your smoke, that, and a lot of times people used to burn fires right in the middle of the room instead of having a chimney to take it out. So you want to keep kind of below the smoke, again, for your breathing. So there's that. But you know what? Because of nutrition in particular, we are a little bit taller than our ancestors, especially certain populations that have switched to high calorie Western diets and all. And there's an interesting also fact that I was in kind of researching this to make sure I had my facts right. Back in the medieval period, people were as tall as we are now. And then they got a little bit shorter. I mean, when I say a little bit, I mean like maybe 2 inches on average. And then they came back up. And more than likely, the reason for that is back in the 1300s and all, we were in a warmer time period. So the growing season was as much as 4 weeks longer.
Okay.
Which means there was lots more food, which means people, again, it's tied into nutrition. People ate more, they were healthier, they weren't starving and disease-ridden as much, except for like when the bubonic plague came through, and that kind of affected everybody health-wise and stature-wise. But so and then from the 1400s until about the mid 1800s, we were in a climate time called the mini ice age. And so when your great grandfather said it was colder back then, and they walked through snowdrifts to school, they weren't lying. It really was colder back then. Periods when when people could make ice in the Shenandoah Valley, for instance, by freezing creeks over, damming them up and freezing them, and then cutting out ice and keeping ice houses. So it really was colder back then, and that affected the growing season, which affected the food, which affected your height. But there's another reason why people think everybody was shorter, is because they see these Civil War uniforms, and they're like, they're so tiny. There's just no soldier could fit in that uniform now. Or you see these dresses of these women who are just so tiny, or these, if you go back to the medieval time, these knights in their suits of armor. And the reason is because one thing is that clothing survived because nobody else could wear it, because it was probably a person who was smaller than average. And so no one else could wear it, so it didn't get worn out. Plus, when you think about, for instance, the Civil War soldiers, so many of the soldiers were teenagers. And how about try any of us getting into the clothes that we wore when we were teenagers, right?
Okay.
So they outgrew them. But George Washington was 6'2". Abraham Lincoln was 6'4". He's the tallest president that we ever had. By contrast, James Madison was 5'4". He was a very sickly. All his life, he was sick with respiratory diseases, and so he was small because he was not healthy. He only weighed about 100 pounds. But I've told people, imagine that you're an archaeologist 500 years in the future, and you're excavating this giant sinkhole that opened up somewhere in the United States. And when this giant sinkhole opened up, they find all these remains of humans who died in there, including a busload of jockeys who were going to a racetrack. And jockeys have to be very small, and that busload of jockeys went into that hole, and they all died in there and were preserved, for the future archaeologists. And then there was also a football team that was going to a game, and that bus went in there and died. And then you had a busload of basketball players, and they all went in there and died. And then the archaeologists digging it up might think, hey, we've got 3 different species of humans that were all living together. And in reality, it's just the extremes of our average. And so when you say people were shorter back then, you're like, not much is the reality.